Zara's family had been planning this summer vacation for months. The beach house rental in the remote coastal town of Blackwater seemed perfect. Secluded, affordable, and right on the ocean. The photos online showed a charming Victorian-era home with weathered shingles and panoramic sea views. What they didn't show was the darkness that lurked within its walls. On their first night, Zara couldn't sleep. The constant sound of waves crashing against the rocks below should have been soothing, but instead it filled her with an inexplicable dread. Around midnight, she heard a strange scratching sound coming from behind her bedroom wall. At first, she thought it might be mice, or perhaps the old house settling, but the scratching was too rhythmic, too deliberate. The next morning, while her parents and younger brother explored the beach, Zara examined her bedroom wall more closely. Running her fingers along the faded floral wallpaper, she discovered a section that felt different, hollow. Using her fingernails, she carefully peeled back a corner of the wallpaper and found a hidden door, barely visible in the dim light. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a narrow room that stretched along the entire length of the house. The air inside was stale and thick with dust, but what made Zara's blood run cold were the photographs covering every inch of the walls. Hundreds of them, all showing families who had stayed in this house over the decades. Each photograph followed the same pattern: a happy family arriving for their vacation, smiling and carefree, but as Zara moved deeper into the room, the photographs became progressively more disturbing. In the second set of photos from each family's stay, one family member would be missing their eyes, just hollow black sockets staring blindly at the camera. The third set showed two family members without eyes. The pattern continued until, in the final photograph of each series, every family member stood eyeless, their faces frozen in silent screams. Zara's hands trembled as she reached the end of the room. There, pinned to the wall with rusty thumbtacks, was a fresh photograph showing her own family arriving at the house just yesterday. Her parents and brothers smiled happily in the image, but Zara's own face was already transformed. Her eyes were gone, replaced by those same hollow, bleeding sockets. She ran to the bathroom and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her scream echoed through the house as she saw herself exactly as she appeared in the photograph. Blood trickled down her cheeks from the empty spaces where her eyes had been. She could no longer see, yet somehow she could still perceive the horror around her. From somewhere in the darkness, she heard her mother calling her name for lunch. But when Zara stumbled downstairs, she realized her mother's voice sounded different. Flat, emotionless. Through her supernatural sight, she saw her family standing in the kitchen, all of them eyeless now, all of them smiling, those terrible, knowing smiles. The beach house had claimed another family. The photographs never lied, and escape was impossible. Zara was now part of the collection, forever trapped in this cursed place, where summer vacations became eternal nightmares.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out, so subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you. Octavio had been looking forward to the Boy Scout camping trip all summer. Camp Whispering Pines was legendary among the Scouts. A week of hiking, fishing, campfires, and ghost stories deep in the Adirondack Mountains. At 16, this would be his final year as a camper before aging out of the program, and he intended to make it memorable. The first 3 days were perfect. The weather was ideal, the fishing was excellent, and Octavio's tent mate, a younger scout named Marcus, proved to be good company despite his tendency to get homesick. Their scout leader, Mr. Brennan, kept the group entertained with wilderness survival lessons and stories about the area's history. It was on the fourth night that things began to go wrong. Octavio woke around midnight to the sound of children singing. At first, he assumed it was a prank, perhaps some of the younger scouts sneaking around the campsite trying to scare each other. But as he listened more carefully, the voices seemed to be coming from deep within the forest, far beyond where any of their group would venture in the dark. The song itself was familiar, Ring Around the Rosie, but the voices singing it were wrong somehow. They were too high-pitched, too perfect, as if they weren't quite human. And there were far too many of them, dozens of children's voices harmonizing in that haunting melody. Marcus was awake too, his eyes wide with fear in the dim light of their battery-powered lantern. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Octavio nodded, putting a finger to his lips. They listened as the singing grew louder, closer. Other tents around the campsite began to rustle as more scouts woke up. Someone unzipped their tent flap, probably Mr. Brennan checking on the situation. But when Octavio looked outside, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Mr. Brennan was standing perfectly still at the edge of the campsite, staring into the dark woods. His posture was rigid, unnatural, and he was humming along with the children's song. The song stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Octavio could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then, one by one, small figures began emerging from between the trees. Children, or what had once been children, dressed in old-fashioned clothing from decades past. Their faces were pale as moonlight, their eyes solid black, and they moved with an eerie, synchronized precision. There were dozens of them, forming a circle around the campsite. As they moved, they began to sing again, but now the words were different. "Campers, campers, time to play. No one leaves at break of day." Mr. Brennan began walking toward the children, his movements jerky like a marionette. Other scouts emerged from their tents, but they too moved with that same unnatural gait. Only Octavio and Marcus remained unaffected, crouched in their tent and paralyzed by terror. "We have to run," Marcus whispered, tears streaming down his face. But as they watched, the circle of ghostly children began to tighten. The other scouts and Mr. Brennan had joined the ring, all of them holding hands, all of them singing that terrible song. Their eyes had turned black, just like the children's, and their faces wore expressions of mindless joy. Octavio realized with growing horror that this had happened before. The children in old-fashioned clothing weren't spirits. They were previous campers, trapped in this place for decades, forced to lure new victims into their eternal game. As the circle closed around their tent, Octavio grabbed Marcus's hand and made a desperate decision. They burst out of the tent and ran directly at the weakest point in the circle, between two of the smallest ghost children. They almost made it. For a moment, it seemed like they might break free and escape into the woods. But as they reached the tree line, Octavio felt cold fingers grab his ankle. He fell hard, Marcus tumbling beside him. The last thing Octavio saw before the darkness claimed him was his own reflection in Marcus's eyes. And his reflection was smiling that same mindless, joyful smile. His eyes had turned black, and he was already beginning to sing. Camp Whispering Pines would report the disappearance of the entire scout troop, of course. Search and rescue teams would comb the mountains for weeks, but they would never find the campsite where children play their eternal game, always looking for new friends to join their circle.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you. 16-year-old Serafina thought the lighthouse keeper job was a dream come true. Summer employment was hard to find in the small coastal town of Grimhaven, and when old Mr. Ashworth offered her the position of assistant lighthouse keeper, she jumped at the chance. The pay was good, the work seemed easy enough, and she'd always been fascinated by the historic lighthouse that stood on the rocky promontory overlooking the harbor. Beacon Point Lighthouse had been guiding ships safely to shore since 1847, Mr. Ashworth explained during her first day of training. The beacon operated automatically now, but tradition and maritime law required a human keeper to maintain the equipment and keep watch for vessels in distress. All Serafina had to do was climb the spiral staircase twice each day, check the light mechanism, and record her observations in the official logbook. "There's just one rule," Mr. Ashworth said as he prepared to leave her alone for her first solo shift. "Never, under any circumstances, extinguish the beacon between sunset and sunrise. Ships depend on that light, and the harbor has dangerous rocks. People's lives are in your hands." The first week passed without incident. Serafina enjoyed the solitude and the spectacular ocean views from the lighthouse's observation deck. She brought books to read during the long evening hours and made herself comfortable in the small apartment attached to the lighthouse base. The work was peaceful, almost meditative. It was during her second week that she began to notice the visitors. Every night just after midnight, figures would appear on the beach below the lighthouse. They looked like people walking along the shoreline, but something about their movement seemed wrong. Too smooth, too purposeful. Through her binoculars, Serafina could see that they were all wearing old-fashioned clothing, the kind sailors might have worn a century ago. They never seemed to notice the lighthouse beam as it swept across the beach. In fact, they cast no shadows when the light passed over them. Curious, Serafina began staying awake later to observe the mysterious beach walkers. There were more of them each night. Dozens, then hundreds of figures in maritime clothing from different historical periods. They would emerge from the ocean itself, water streaming from their clothes, and walk in single file along the beach toward the harbor. On her 10th night alone at the lighthouse, Serafina made a terrible discovery. While researching the lighthouse's history in Mr. Ashworth's collection of maritime records, she found dozens of newspaper clippings about shipwrecks in the harbor. The Celestial Dawn in 1923, the Northern Star in 1956, the Maiden's Dream in 1972, and many others. Hundreds of sailors had died on the rocks below when their ships missed the harbor entrance in storms and fog. But according to the lighthouse logbooks, the beacon had been burning brightly during every single wreck. The next night, Serafina watched the ghostly figures more carefully. As dawn approached, she saw them walk directly into the harbor waters and disappear beneath the waves. But just before they submerged, several of them turned to look up at the lighthouse. Their faces were bloated and pale, their eyes milky white, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. They weren't walking along the beach, they were trying to reach the lighthouse. The beacon that was supposed to guide ships safely to safety was actually luring them onto the rocks. The lighthouse was cursed, and she was its unwitting accomplice. That night, as the phantom sailors began their nightly pilgrimage, Serafina made a decision that would haunt her forever. She climbed to the top of the lighthouse and switched off the beacon. The effect was immediate. The ghostly figures on the beach stopped walking and turned as one to stare at the darkened lighthouse. Their mouths opened wider, and though no sound reached her, she could sense their rage and desperation. But her horror was just beginning. Out in the harbor, she could see the lights of a real ship, a fishing boat returning late from the Grand Banks. Without the lighthouse beacon, the captain would never see the rocks in time. Serafina watched helplessly as the fishing boat struck the hidden reef with tremendous force. The vessel broke apart in minutes, its crew's screams carrying across the water. As the survivors struggled in the dark waves, the phantom sailors began walking toward them, reaching out with pale, waterlogged hands. She turned the beacon back on, but it was too late. The fishing boat was gone, its crew joining the eternal procession of the drowned. And now Serafina understood the terrible truth. The lighthouse didn't cause the shipwrecks. It prevented them from being even worse. The beacon was the only thing keeping the harbor's hungry ghosts from actively hunting for new victims. She was trapped in an impossible situation, doomed to guide ships safely past the rocks while knowing that every vessel she saved meant the phantom sailors would have to wait longer for their chance at revenge. And on nights when no ships passed by, they would turn their attention to the lighthouse itself, climbing the spiral staircase with their cold, dead fingers, looking for the keeper who held their salvation just out of reach. Serafina never left Beacon Point Lighthouse again. Years later, when Mr. Ashworth's body was found at the bottom of the cliffs, locals assumed he'd slipped on the wet rocks, but they never found Serafina. But ships still report seeing a young woman in the lighthouse window, forever keeping watch over the cursed harbor and its eternal inhabitants.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now, before the next nightmare finds you. Valentina had always loved summer for one reason above all others: the ice cream truck. Every year when school let out, she would wait by her bedroom window for that familiar, jaunty melody to echo through the neighborhood streets. This summer was no different, except for one disturbing detail. She was the only one who seemed to hear it. The music would start every day at exactly 3:17 p.m., playing that cheerful tune she remembered from childhood. But when Valentina rushed outside with her allowance money clutched in her sweaty palm, the street was always completely empty. No colorful truck, no other children running with dollar bills, no vendor calling out the daily specials. Just empty asphalt shimmering in the afternoon heat. Her parents thought she was imagining things. Her younger sister Lucia claimed she couldn't hear any music at all. Even their neighbors, the Hendersons, looked at Valentina with concern when she asked if they'd seen the ice cream truck. Mrs. Henderson had lived on Maple Street for 30 years and insisted that no ice cream trucks had serviced their neighborhood since the incident in 1987. What incident? Valentina had asked. But Mrs. Henderson just shook her head and hurried back inside. Determined to solve the mystery, Valentina began following the sound. On the 7th day of summer vacation, she grabbed her bicycle and pedaled frantically through the streets, chasing the melody as it seemed to move through the neighborhood. The music led her farther from home than she'd ever ventured alone, through increasingly run-down areas where the houses stood empty and weeds grew through cracked sidewalks. Finally, the melody stopped. Valentina found herself in a vacant lot surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. In the center of the lot sat an old ice cream truck, its once bright paint job now faded and peeling. The cheerful images of popsicles and ice cream cones were barely visible beneath layers of grime and decay. But the music was definitely coming from inside the truck, along with something else. Muffled sounds that might have been crying or screaming or both. Valentina approached cautiously, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The service window was open, and through the grimy glass, she could see dozens of small hands pressed against the interior walls. Children's hands, pale and desperate, leaving foggy handprints on the windows from inside the truck. The faces that belonged to those hands were barely human anymore. Their eyes had rolled back to show only whites. Their mouths hung open in silent screams, and their skin had taken on a bluish tint, as if they'd been frozen from the inside out. "Welcome, welcome," called a voice from the front of the truck. The ice cream man appeared at the service window, his vendor's uniform stained with something dark and sticky. His smile was too wide, stretching beyond the natural limits of his face, and his teeth were brown and rotting. "I have something special just for you." He opened the back door of the truck, and Valentina could see the truth. The interior wasn't filled with freezers and ice cream. It was crammed with children, all of them her age, all of them trapped in various states of frozen animation. Some of them had been there so long that frost covered their hair and eyelashes. "Don't worry," the ice cream man said, his voice like breaking glass. "The cold only hurts for a little while. Then you'll get to play with all your new friends forever and ever." Valentina tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The cheerful melody grew louder and louder until it felt like her skull might crack from the pressure. She felt herself being pulled toward the truck's open door, toward the frozen children who reached out to welcome her into their eternal summer nightmare. The last thing she heard before the cold claimed her was the ice cream truck's melody, playing on and on, calling to the next lonely child who would hear it and follow.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you. The Grand Paradise Resort promised the vacation of a lifetime. And for 15-year-old Darius, it seemed too good to be true. The hotel was massive, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and a staff that catered to every whim. But the crown jewel of the resort was undoubtedly the Olympic-sized swimming pool on the rooftop terrace, with its pristine blue water and stunning views of the city skyline. What struck Darius as odd was how empty the pool always seemed to be. Despite the hotel being fully booked with families and couples, he never saw another soul swimming in those inviting waters. When he asked the concierge about it, the man's smile faltered for just a moment before he explained that the pool had specific operating hours and that Darius was special to have access during off-peak times. On his third day at the resort, Darius decided to take an evening swim. The pool area was deserted, lit only by underwater lights that cast an eerie blue glow across the water's surface. The silence was unsettling. No splashing, no laughter, just the gentle hum of the pool's filtration system. He dove in with perfect form, expecting the refreshing embrace of chlorinated water. Instead, the liquid that surrounded him felt thick, viscous, almost syrupy. Panic set in as he tried to surface, but an invisible force seemed to be pulling him down deeper into the pool than should have been physically possible. As his eyes adjusted to the underwater environment, Darius saw the truth that the resort staff had been hiding. The bottom of the pool wasn't tiled. It was carpeted with human bones. Dozens of skeletons lay scattered across the pool floor, still wearing the tattered remains of swimwear from different eras. Some wore vintage one-pieces from the 1950s. Others sported modern board shorts and bikinis. The skeletons weren't motionless. As Darius watched in growing horror, they began to move, their bony fingers reaching upward toward him with desperate, grasping motions. He realized that the pool wasn't filled with water at all. It was filled with the liquefied remains of every guest who had ever entered these cursed waters. His lungs began to burn as the grotesque fluid filled them. The taste was indescribable, metallic, rotten, with hints of chlorine that couldn't mask the underlying decay. As consciousness faded, Darius understood that he was becoming part of this horrifying collection, another victim of the Grand Paradise Resort's dark secret. The hotel management would report him missing, of course. They would express their deepest condolences to his family, launch a thorough investigation, and offer their full cooperation with local authorities. But they would never mention the rooftop pool, and they would never explain why room service continued to deliver fresh towels to the pool area every single day. Within the week, Darius's flesh had dissolved completely, leaving only his skeleton to join the others at the bottom of the pool. His bones would reach upward for the next victim, just as the others had reached for him. The Grand Paradise Resort would continue operating, continue advertising its exclusive rooftop swimming experience, and continue claiming new victims for its liquid graveyard. The pool's filtration system hummed contentedly, processing its latest addition.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now, before the next nightmare finds you.